We all wear a mask, a persona. It's the social role we play to fit in, to be accepted. At first, it seems harmless. We need this mask to function in society, whether at work, with friends, or even online. But what happens when we start believing that the mask is who we really are? That's the trap. The more we identify with this false self, the further we drift from our true essence. Jung warned us about this, saying that over-identifying with the persona can lead to psychological disconnection and inner conflict. Think about it. How many times have you adjusted your behavior, or even your personality, to meet someone else's expectations? The truth is, society rewards conformity. We're constantly encouraged to fit in and follow the rules. And while that seems fine on the surface, it comes with a hidden cost. When we play the role long enough, we forget that it's just that, a role. We stop being ourselves and start living for others. This is the danger Jung warned us about. The persona becomes a mask that hides who we really are. But here's the kicker. It's not just about pretending. The more we wear the mask, the more disconnected we become from our true self. We lose touch with our desires, our passions, and our authenticity. What's worse, we may never even realize that we're doing it. The persona becomes so ingrained in our lives that we start living someone else's life instead of our own. That's the beginning of the trap. And the only way out is to recognize the mask for what it is. And that's what we're going to dive into next. The persona is the version of yourself that the world sees, the curated identity you present to fit into society. It's shaped by your culture, upbringing, career, and even your social media presence. From childhood, we learn which traits are acceptable and which must be hidden. Slowly, we build a mask that pleases others and protects us from rejection. It's not who we truly are, but who we've learned to be. Jung called it a functional lie, a necessary illusion. At its core, the persona is not evil, it's adaptive. It helps you navigate social roles, the professional at work, the friend at parties, the partner in relationships. Without some kind of persona, functioning in the world would be chaotic. But the danger lies in believing the role is the reality. When the persona becomes fused with our identity, we stop asking who we really are beneath it. That's when the mask becomes a prison. We often assume we're making free choices, but most of our behavior is filtered through this mask. The clothes we wear, the opinions we express, even our ambitions, are they truly ours, or are they projections shaped by the role we think we should play? Jung believed that without introspection, we become characters in a play written by others. And over time, the real self, the spontaneous, instinctive, creative core, begins to vanish under layers of performance. The persona is not built overnight. It's constructed piece by piece, based on feedback from others. A compliment becomes a cue. A criticism becomes a warning. We learn to polish the mask to avoid pain and gain approval. But this also means parts of ourselves are buried in the process. Our anger, sadness, desires, and doubts. These rejected parts don't disappear. They retreat into the unconscious, fueling what Jung called the shadow. Wearing the persona can feel safe. It gives us a script, a sense of order. But the price of that safety is authenticity. Many people go through life never realizing they've become a stranger to themselves. They confuse social validation with self-worth. Jung warned that identifying too strongly with the persona leads to stagnation. You might look successful, but inside you feel empty because you're not living your life, just playing a role. Ultimately, the persona is a tool, not a truth. You can't destroy it, and you shouldn't. But you must learn to see it for what it is. A mask, not your soul. The goal is not to reject the persona, but to detach from it. To stop confusing the role with the self. Only then can you begin the deeper psychological work of discovering who you really are. And that journey begins by questioning the image you show the world. When you begin to believe that your persona is your identity, you start living a life scripted by external demands. You act how you're supposed to act, say what's acceptable, and think within boundaries that aren't even yours. It feels like you're performing all the time. This performance may earn praise and stability, but it silently erodes your soul. Jung called this a betrayal of the self, a psychological tragedy that goes unnoticed. You become successful, but you feel hollow. Over-identifying with the persona is not just inauthentic, it's exhausting. Maintaining a mask requires constant emotional labor. You suppress your real reactions, censor your thoughts, and hide your fears. Every day becomes a stage where you must smile, impress, comply. But the more effort you put into appearing perfect, the further you drift from who you really are. This disconnect creates an inner tension that can manifest as anxiety, fatigue, or even depression. The trap is subtle. You might think, this is just adulthood, everyone compromises. And yes, some compromise is part of life. But when compromise becomes self-erasure, you're no longer adapting, you're disappearing. Jung warned that people often confuse adaptation with surrender. And once you've surrendered too much, there's almost nothing left to return to. You've become the role, and the actor has vanished. Psychological suicide doesn't look dramatic. It looks like quiet numbness, a life that looks full from the outside, but feels empty on the inside. You check the boxes, follow the plan, and smile when you're supposed to, yet something feels missing. That something is you. Jung believed that many mental health issues stem from this disconnection. Not knowing who you are isn't just confusing, it's dangerous. What's terrifying is how normal this all feels. The persona is rewarded with jobs, relationships, social approval. And the real self? Often punished. It's called too intense, too weird, or too much. So we keep shrinking, editing, polishing the mask. But no amount of approval can replace authenticity. No number of followers can fill the void of a self you've buried to be liked. Jung's message is clear. The more we cling to the mask, the more we lose touch with our essence. Over time, that essence stops speaking. The inner voice becomes a whisper, then silence. This is not just about psychology, it's about your life. If you lose yourself, what exactly are you trying to succeed as? The danger of over-identifying with the persona is not just that you'll live a lie, it's that you'll forget it's a lie. From the moment we're born, we're taught how to behave, what's acceptable, what's admired, what's shameful. Parents reward us when we're polite, teachers praise us when we follow the rules, and society applauds those who fit the mold. Slowly, we learn that authenticity is risky and conformity is safe. This conditioning doesn't stop in childhood, it only gets more sophisticated. Jung believed that the modern world is designed to shape personas, not individuals. The system favors masks. Social media is the perfect example. We curate a version of ourselves that looks happy, successful, and likable, even if it's far from the truth. The more likes we get, the more we're incentivized to play the role. But that role becomes addictive and worse, expected. You start performing even when the camera's off. Jung warned that in such environments, it becomes nearly impossible to know who you really are. The persona becomes not just a mask, but a trap. In school, we're taught obedience, not introspection. At work, we're expected to be efficient, not authentic. In friendships, we often play the agreeable character to avoid conflict. And in romantic relationships, we may act like the ideal partner rather than be our true, flawed selves. These roles are reinforced by rewards, praise, promotions, love, acceptance. But these are conditional. Society says, be who we want you to be, and we'll give you what you crave. That's not freedom. That's a transaction. The tragedy is that we often don't even notice it happening. We think we're making choices, but we're actually following scripts. Scripts written by culture, family, religion, capitalism, and the need to be liked. Jung saw this as one of the great diseases of modern man, the loss of individuality in the name of fitting in. We don't just wear the mask, we forget it's a mask. And then we wonder why we feel so anxious, so empty, so lost. Even rebellion can become a persona. The edgy identity, the spiritual identity, the intellectual outsider, all of these can still be performances. Society doesn't just reward conformity, it co-opts resistance too. As long as your rebellion is branded and marketable, it's accepted. Jung would argue that real authenticity isn't loud, it's silent and personal. It doesn't seek attention, it seeks wholeness, and wholeness can't be faked. To break free, we must first see how deep the influence runs. It's not about blaming society, it's about waking up. Society will always offer roles. That's unavoidable. The real question is, are you the actor or the puppet? Jung's challenge wasn't to abandon society, but to stop mistaking approval for identity. The world will try to tell you who you are. Your job is to remember who you were before you believed them. When the persona takes over, something subtle but devastating happens. We begin to forget who we are. Not all at once, but gradually. Our real opinions get filtered. Our instincts get overridden. Our dreams start to feel unrealistic. Every day we bend just a little more until the real self becomes silent, distant, almost like a ghost we once knew but can't quite remember. Individuality is not just about being different. It's about being true. And truth doesn't always fit the script. It's not always polite, presentable, or marketable. But when we abandon our truth to please others, we don't just lose authenticity, we lose vitality. Jung warned that many people live outwardly successful lives while feeling inwardly dead. Because what's the point of achievement if it wasn't even you who chose the path? This loss of individuality is dangerous because it's invisible. No one tells you you've lost yourself. In fact, the world might applaud you for it, tell you that you're doing great. But deep down, there's a quiet ache. A voice that whispers, "This isn't who I really am." Most people ignore that voice. They drown it in busyness, consumption, or constant validation. But Jung believed that ignoring it only leads to a deeper, chronic suffering. When individuality is lost, so is creativity. You stop thinking for yourself. You wait for permission. You copy trends, follow rules, echo the loudest voice in the room. But something inside you starts to rot. Not physically, but psychologically. Jung saw this decay as one of the most common causes of midlife crises, existential dread, and even depression. The soul doesn't die, it just waits, hoping you'll come back for it. The tragedy is, we often trade our individuality for safety. We think that if we just play the part well enough, nothing bad will happen. But Jung reminds us, there's nothing more dangerous than betraying your own nature. Because the cost is internal. You might get the job, the relationship, the approval, but you'll feel like an actor in someone else's movie. And eventually, the role will feel unbearable. Reclaiming individuality means questioning everything, your goals, your beliefs, your habits, your identity. Not to destroy them, but to find out which ones are truly yours. Jung didn't preach rebellion for its own sake, he preached integration. The goal is not to discard the persona, but to stop letting it control you. Your individuality is still there, buried under layers of performance. You just have to dig deep enough to find it again. Breaking free doesn't start with rebellion, it starts with awareness. You don't need to burn your life down to reclaim your identity. What you need is clarity. Begin by observing the mask you wear, how you talk in meetings, how you behave in relationships, how you filter your thoughts. Notice where you're performing instead of being. Most people don't realize they're acting until the mask starts to suffocate them. Jung believed that the persona wasn't evil, it was just incomplete. It's a tool, not a self. But when you believe you are the mask, you abandon the vastness of who you really are. And the tragedy is, most people never question the role they're playing. They just keep performing, thinking that if they smile harder or try more, the emptiness will go away. But performance never fills the soul, only presence does. Reclaiming your true self starts with discomfort. You'll feel naked without the mask. You might lose approval. People may not like the real you. But Jung taught that this discomfort is a rite of passage. It's the shedding of false skin. You'll have to grieve parts of your identity, the people pleaser, the achiever, the nice guy. But what you gain in return is something most never touch, a real sense of self. Start by asking hard questions. What would I do if I wasn't afraid of judgment? Whose expectations am I really living for? Which parts of me have I silenced to be accepted? These are not easy answers. They demand honesty and courage. But Jung believed that asking these questions was the beginning of true psychological growth. You can't become whole if you don't first confront how fragmented you've become. The journey back to your true self isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. It's about reconnecting with your instincts, your curiosity, your intuition. These are the parts of you the persona buried. And as you peel back the layers, you might be surprised to find that your real self was never weak. It was just waiting for permission to return. Freedom begins when you stop outsourcing your identity, when you no longer need applause to feel worthy, when your choices align with your values, not your fears. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of all your parts into a unified whole. And while it's not easy, it's the only path that leads to a life that's truly yours. Not performed, not borrowed, but lived fully and unapologetically. The persona isn't the only player in Jung's psychological framework. Behind the mask lies something far more primal, the shadow. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves we deny, repress, or deem unacceptable. It's everything the persona refuses to show. Our rage, envy, selfishness, but also our untapped power, creativity, and instinct. When we over-identify with being good, the shadow collects everything we label bad. And the more we deny it, the more it grows silently in the dark. Jung warned that the shadow doesn't disappear, it adapts. It shows up in passive-aggressive behavior, projections, addictions, and unexplained emotional outbursts. You think you're in control, but you're not. The mask is in front, the shadow is behind the wheel. When the persona dominates consciousness, the shadow compensates in the unconscious. And this is where danger lives. The parts of you that are unlived will find a way to be expressed, whether you like it or not. We're taught to suppress anything that threatens our image, especially emotions that might make us look weak, wrong, or out of control. But Jung believed that what we repress doesn't vanish, it festers. The more we polish our persona, the more the shadow becomes wild and unruly. It's like putting a lid on a boiling pot. Eventually it explodes. And when it does, you don't just lose control, you lose clarity, direction, and trust in yourself. The tragic irony is that we often judge others for the very things we've rejected in ourselves. That's projection, a key mechanism of the shadow. You see the arrogance, the anger, the selfishness out there, when it's actually within you, denied and disowned. Jung believed that facing the shadow was the path to wholeness, but only if you have the courage to look at what you've tried to hide. Integration doesn't mean acting on the shadow. It means recognizing it, accepting it, and choosing how to channel it. The shadow isn't just darkness. It also contains hidden potential. Your assertiveness, your boldness, your sexual energy, your intuition. All of these can be locked in the shadow if they don't match your social mask. By confronting the shadow, you reclaim what you've lost. You gain access to a raw, honest power that the persona could never provide. It's not about becoming dangerous, it's about becoming real. Authenticity isn't clean. It's messy. It's human. To live authentically, you must integrate the shadow, not escape it. The more you run, the more it haunts you. But when you turn toward it, something paradoxical happens. The fear dissolves and strength emerges. Jung said that the gold is in the dark, meaning your greatest growth lies in what you fear facing. Only by acknowledging your shadow can you truly break free from the tyranny of the persona. And only then can you live a life that is fully, fearlessly your own. At first, living through the persona feels safe, even rewarding. You're praised for being agreeable, successful, polite, responsible. You meet expectations, you make people comfortable. But over time, something begins to crack beneath the surface. You start to feel like a stranger in your own life, walking through a script you didn't write. The applause grows louder, but the meaning grows quieter. You begin to feel a quiet numbness, not enough to scream, but enough to dull the soul. Days blur together. You say the right things, smile at the right times, nod, comply, perform. But deep inside, a question lingers. Who am I really? The life you're living may look successful, even admirable. But if it isn't yours, if it doesn't reflect your truth, it will never satisfy your soul. It will always feel like wearing someone else's clothes. Jung understood that psychological suffering doesn't always come from trauma or failure. Sometimes it comes from compliance, from becoming everything others wanted you to be, and nothing of what you truly are. That kind of quiet self-abandonment is dangerous. It leads to chronic emptiness, depression, anxiety, and even existential despair. You may look fine on the outside, but inside, the core is eroding. Your soul knows the difference between authenticity and performance, even if your ego pretends not to. This dissonance creates a subtle inner war. One part of you wants to maintain the image, the persona, the role you've built so carefully. The other part is screaming to be seen, raw, flawed, real. The longer you ignore that voice, the more disconnected you become from your own vitality. You lose the ability to feel fully. You start to confuse peace with numbness and success with sedation. That's not growth, that's soul suffocation. We often rationalize this state as being mature or professional, but Jung would argue it's simply fear in disguise. Fear of rejection, fear of chaos, fear of being seen in your entirety. And yet, without that risk, there is no true connection, no joy, no real power. A life lived entirely through the persona is a life lived under someone else's rules, someone else's script, even if you don't know who wrote it. To Jung, the greatest tragedy wasn't failure, it was inauthenticity. Living a life that looks good but feels wrong. A life shaped by shoulds instead of wants. If you feel empty, lost, or unfulfilled, it might not be because you're doing too little, but because you're doing too much of the wrong thing. Not your dream, not your path, not your truth. And until you face that, you'll always feel like you're living someone else's life. The journey toward your true self often begins with a quiet inner rebellion, a whisper that says, "This isn't me." It doesn't always start with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it's a subtle ache, a dissatisfaction with the life you've built. But that discomfort is sacred. It's the soul trying to rise. Jung believed that the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, begins when you stop running from yourself. When you stop numbing and start listening. To embrace your true self, you must confront the parts you've rejected, not just the pain, but also your forgotten power, the dreams you abandoned, the truths you silenced to keep the peace. These are not flaws, they are fragments of your wholeness. Reclaiming them isn't easy. It requires brutal honesty and deep compassion. But it's the only way to move from performance to presence, from survival to sovereignty. We live in a world that trains us to be liked, not to be real. So when you start peeling back the persona, you might feel exposed, vulnerable, misunderstood. That's natural. Most people have never met the real you. Maybe you haven't either. But underneath the fear lies something deeper, liberation. Because once you start being honest about who you are, you'll never want to go back to pretending. This process isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. Jung taught that true selfhood includes both light and shadow, your kindness and your rage, your clarity and your confusion. Embracing your true self means embracing your contradictions. The more you integrate these parts, the more grounded and powerful you become. Not because you're flawless, but because you're real. One of the hardest truths is that not everyone will accept the real you. People who love the mask may reject the person underneath. But that's part of the cost of freedom. You will lose some things, but what you gain is worth far more: peace, alignment, inner strength. When you no longer betray yourself to please others, you stop being a puppet and start becoming a creator of your own life. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who your parents wanted you to be, not who society rewarded, but the unique, messy, powerful being that exists beneath the mask. That self has always been there waiting. The moment you choose truth over image, your real life begins. And with it, a depth of joy and clarity no persona could ever provide. To live authentically is to live in truth, not a polished, curated version of truth, but the raw, unfiltered essence of who you are. It's about waking up in the morning and not having to perform. No mask, no script, no audience to please. Just alignment. Your words, your values, your actions, all flowing from the same source. That's not just peace, that's power. Most people spend their lives running from themselves, chasing careers, relationships, or lifestyles that don't actually resonate. Authentic living demands the opposite: stillness, presence, introspection. It asks you to feel rather than distract, to question rather than conform. This isn't comfortable. It often means shedding everything that gave you false safety. But once the illusions fall, what's left is real. There is a clarity that comes when you stop negotiating your identity to win approval. You stop asking, "What do they want me to be?" and start asking, "Who am I when no one's watching?" Jung believed that this self-recognition is the foundation of mental health. When your outer life reflects your inner truth, anxiety fades. You don't need to fake confidence. You are confidence, rooted in self-honesty. Authenticity doesn't mean impulsively acting on every desire. It's not chaos. It's coherence. It's living with intention, integrity, and inner alignment. You're not reacting, you're choosing. You're not driven by fear, you're guided by clarity. Jung saw this as the path to individuation, becoming a unified self, rather than a fragmented persona scattered across social roles and masks. The paradox is that when you stop trying to impress the world, you become infinitely more magnetic. People are drawn to truth, even if they can't name it. They feel your groundedness. Your energy becomes clean, undistorted. In a world drowning in performance, authenticity becomes rebellion. And that rebellion, quiet, grounded, sincere, can shift not just your life, but the lives around you. True freedom is not about having everything, it's about needing less. Needing less validation, less approval, less applause. Authentic living isn't just a mental concept, it's a way of being that reprograms your nervous system. You no longer live in survival mode. You begin to exist, fully, unapologetically. And in that space, life stops feeling like a role, and starts feeling like yours. Escaping the grip of the persona isn't an intellectual exercise, it's an act of bravery. It requires the courage to be misunderstood, rejected, even abandoned. Because when you stop playing the role others expect, they may not applaud your authenticity, they might resist it. Your new truth threatens the illusion they've grown comfortable with. But discomfort is the price of liberation. And liberation begins where fear is no longer the master. Courage means walking away from applause that isn't meant for you. It means letting go of relationships that only existed to serve your persona. The moment you drop the mask, you risk everything. But what you gain is worth more than safety. You gain your soul back. Jung knew that the path to individuation is lined with resistance, internal and external. But resistance is proof you're getting closer to truth. This isn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's about reclaiming your voice from the noise. Every time you say no to a role that doesn't fit, you say yes to the self that's been buried underneath. Courage, in this context, is not about fighting others. It's about confronting the false self you've built to survive. And that battle is quiet, invisible, and sacred. We often wait for permission to change, as if someone else's approval could validate our inner transformation. But no one will ever tell you, it's safe now. Be real. That moment never comes. You have to leap while your hands are still shaking. Jung believed that the call to authenticity is a hero's journey, and every hero must face fear before they find freedom. The hardest part is that breaking the persona feels like death, and in many ways it is. It's the death of who you pretended to be, the death of illusions, the death of safety. But something stronger is born in its place, an identity not constructed, but discovered. One that doesn't need to perform, one that simply is. This is the self that can finally breathe. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite it. The persona offers you comfort at the cost of your soul. Courage demands discomfort, but gives you your soul in return. And once you taste that freedom, real, raw, internal freedom, you can't go back. You stop surviving and start living. Authentically, powerfully, unapologetically. The persona may provide temporary comfort, but its long-term effects are insidious. While it allows us to navigate the social world, it ultimately keeps us at a distance from ourselves. Over time, the gap between who we present and who we truly are grows wider, creating a void that can only be filled with disconnection. We start to feel like strangers in our own lives, playing roles that don't resonate with our true desires or values. This is the consequence of living through the persona, a life that isn't ours, a life we never fully inhabit. Jung's warning is not merely philosophical, it's a call to action. He urges us to recognize the destructive impact of over-identifying with the persona and the psychological toll it takes. By constantly seeking external validation, we strip ourselves of the very essence that makes us unique. The persona is an illusion, a mask that we wear to appease others, but in doing so, we lose the ability to authentically connect with ourselves. Our deepest potential remains dormant, overshadowed by the roles we've accepted out of fear or societal pressure. To truly live, we must start living for ourselves, not for others' expectations. This means shedding the masks and confronting the discomfort that comes with revealing our real selves. It's a journey that requires courage, as breaking free from the persona can feel like losing everything we thought we knew about ourselves. But in reality, it's about gaining everything we've been denying: our individuality, our power, our authenticity. The freedom to live as we truly are is worth the risk of vulnerability. Living your own life means making choices based on your true desires, not on the need for approval or acceptance. It requires understanding that the roles we play in society are just that, roles. They don't define us. They are constructs created by external forces, and while they serve a function, they do not encapsulate our true identity. Our true self lies beyond the mask, in the parts of us that are raw, unpolished, and real. It is in embracing this authenticity that we step into a life that is genuinely our own. The process of self-discovery and integration is ongoing. It's not something that happens overnight, but rather through a consistent commitment to honesty with ourselves. Jung emphasized the importance of self-awareness in this process. We must learn to recognize when we are acting from a place of societal conditioning rather than personal truth. The more we align our actions with our true values, the more we break free from the persona's grip. This is the path to true freedom. In the end, living your own life is about living with purpose, clarity, and self-respect. It's about creating a reality where you are not bound by external expectations, but driven by your internal compass. True fulfillment comes not from fitting in, but from standing out as your authentic self. Jung's message is clear. The only life worth living is the one that is fully, unapologetically yours. And the courage to live it is the key to unlocking your fullest potential. If you felt trapped by the roles society expects you to play, it's time to break free. Take a moment to reflect on who you really are, beyond the mask you've been wearing. If this video resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives into personal growth and psychological insights. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how the persona has shaped your life. Let's start a conversation about reclaiming our authenticity. Remember, the power to live your own life is in your hands.